Good afternoon. Thank you very much. And thanks to the previous presenters for some great talks and the online participants for sticking around. I think you'll like Emyria's unique approach to the medicinal cannabis opportunity globally, and look forward to sharing that with you. If you could go to the next slide, skip a couple if you don't mind. Great. So Emyria's goal is to develop registered treatments. These are formally approved medications with major global regulators. We achieve that by the clinical evidence that we gather treating patients with unmet needs across our clinical network. And I'll explain how that is all put together shortly. We've had a great return over the last 12 months, some good investor support behind our drug development programs, which we've announced. We recently raised $5 million last month. We're in a strong cash position to get that work done. If you go to the next slide, please. Great. So we've got some really unique assets here. We have a network of specialist medical centres around Australia that treat patients with a diverse range of unmet needs. Most of those patients are referred to us because they're not getting response from standard treatment. Most of those referrals come from their specialist physician, and we have a really good rapport with the medical community in that regard. We have seen over 4,000 patients, and each of those patients is now part of our ongoing longitudinal registry, which is our other core asset and point of difference. We've invested heavily in the data infrastructure that supports our clinical service, and that has allowed us to build an incredible real-world data set about how these treatments work best and for whom. And we use those insights to provide individualized care back to our patients, and it also helps us launch very focused drug development programs, for specific drug dose indications. And you can see the ones that are in progress right now. EMD 003 focused on psychological distress. That is aimed to be a cannabinoid over-the-counter medicine under the Schedule 3 program here in Australia, working on that with partner Can Group. We have EMD 004 in development as well for symptoms of irritable bowel syndrome. And we also have a partnership with Mind Medicine Australia working on MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder, which I'm happy to speak about as well. And I'll just say one key thing about, taking a leadership position in registered drug treatments. One really needs intellectual property around ideally the dose form, and secondly, the method of use for these treatments, which are essentially generic medications applied to new problem spaces. We can go to the next slide, please. Here's the brains of our operation, which is the robust clinical data we've gathered. I want to highlight a couple of things here. One is the diversity of the patients that we see at Emyria and at our Emerald clinics. Children as young as 2, patients as old as 96. The second thing is the diversity of experience we have with the products that we prescribe. Anywhere between 0 to 600 milligrams of CBD a day, anywhere between 0 and 200 milligrams of THC. So we have a really good read and grasp on how these treatments work, what the side effect profiles are like, what are the clinical outcomes that patients can experience. And it's those insights which enable us to give good care to our patients, but also supports our strategic drug development work. We could go to the next slide, please. There was a question asked earlier in the day about what patients receive medicinal cannabis. Here is a snapshot of our patient population. A majority come in for complex chronic pain, but you can see we have this very long tail of patients with primary mental health concerns, cancer-related symptom treatment, neurological disorders, and a long list of other indications as well. So really the patients receiving medicinal cannabis or seeking help for their condition really represents a really diverse, rich group. Each of these unmet needs becomes potentially an indication for a new registered drug treatment. We can go to the next slide. Terrific. And so I want to kind of emphasize here what advantages we have by running our own clinical service. Because of our patients and their complex clinical conditions, at some extremes, the clinical service is almost as important in the care and delivery as the drug treatment alone. And that's certainly true when we talk about some of the frontier areas like psychedelic assisted therapy for things like post-traumatic stress disorder. The clinical service and how you wrap around the care team around that treatment is almost just as important as the drug therapy. On the other extreme, it is possible to take drug treatments that could be relevant for a much larger patient population. And if you take those treatments through formal registration, they can become over-the-counter or prescription medicines for a much, much larger population. And I think that really opens the real market for these treatments. So right now you can see we have here laid out on this diagram both programs at the over-the-counter side for EMD 003 and of course some of the more complex spaces like MDMA for PTSD. If we can go to the next slide, please. Here's our pipeline and a little bit about the progress of these different treatment programs and indications. A couple are well underway. EMD 003 about to commence pivotal studies, EMD 004 finalizing dose forms there, and they will enter pivotal studies also. But as you can see, a very long list of potential indications that we can explore. Each represent global market opportunities for us. Next slide, please. And the next one. Now, why are we so committed to registration? We heard from Cassandra earlier today about there are now 190, I have to update this slide, different medical products available in Australia, but really only one with formal registration and PBS coverage. And that's GW Pharma's Epidiolex. If we go to the next slide, please. Just look at the prescription volumes. If we take the estimate that roughly there are 8,000 to 10,000 SASB prescriptions per month in Australia for medicinal cannabis, perhaps that totals to maybe 100,000. Let's say it's 200,000 medicinal cannabis prescriptions over a year. We would say that represented terrific growth. But just look at the number of antidepressants prescribed annually in Australia, 29 million, or in the UK, nearly 70 million prescriptions per year. We also heard some excitement around the growth of authorised prescribers, nearly 400 authorised prescribers in Australia. There are 42,000 prescribing general practitioners in Australia. So to really reach the true potential of this market, if we are truly committed to producing medicines to reach patients, then truly the considerate thing to do is to take those treatments through the registration pathway. And that's what we're committed to doing. If we can go to the next slide, please. It makes commercial sense to do the registration work as well. GW Pharma was recently acquired by Jazz Pharmaceuticals for $7 billion. One of the chief medical officers and head of global R&D, Karen Smith, is now part of our strategic advisory, helping us think through the proper pharmaceutical pathways to take our cannabis products through the registration work and to create that value. We can go to the next slide, please, and the one after this. Great. So a couple of things that motivate us. We know we're making a difference to patients' lives. We have lots of case studies like Bob, where we see a gentleman who had chronic pain for a long period of time, was heavily medicated on a range of different treatments, including high-dose opioids, but really had poor quality of life. At about 6 months of care with us, after an individualized treatment program, he settled on a treatment that worked for him. It was very effective. He became off all his pain medications, including all of his opioids, but we can also see great improvements in his quality of life. And it's stories like Bob's which motivate us to try and find how can we make a difference to other people like Bob who are out there who can't reach our clinics. If we go to the next slide, please. And we know that Bob is not just a one-off case. We recently completed a really fascinating research project with IQVIA, who are a major global CRO, a clinical research organization. Their market cap is around $44 billion. They help the world's largest pharmaceutical companies get registered treatments. IQVIA also have access to some really interesting real-world data, particularly in Australia. And we were able to look at the dispensing prescription activity of patients that come to see treatment at Emyria. And then we could look back 12 months before those patients arrived at our clinics and have a look at their opioid consumption. And as you can see in this chart, to the left of the yellow line was the average monthly opioid use for a group of patients stratified by dependency on opioids. And as you can see to the right, after treatment with us, a significant reduction in their opioid consumption. Now, that's not just our clinics or our nurses telling you that that's what we're seeing. We're actually seeing this validated in the real world prescription behaviors of these patients. And now we're able to ask a whole heap of other really interesting questions. How can we identify these patients? Can we develop an indication? How can we come up with a custom dose form to treat these people and get that treatment registered globally? We can go to the next slide, please. And the one after this. So right now, one of our key leading programs is EMD 003. We bring a lot of our experience and our prior investment to this program, and it's one of the reasons we have confidence we'll be one of the first across the line. We have real world data on the dose form, we have IP around the method of use, we have developed protocols and a clear regulatory strategy in place to deliver on the S3 program, and we have a unique dose form with partner Can Group as well, which has already completed some of the preliminary clinical work required to get this drug registered. So once we have our pivotal studies underway and completed, we think we can be one of the first to get a Schedule 3 registration and really just prove our method and our model, and then do that again for other indications and other dose forms, and then take those treatments to the bigger markets globally. We can go to the next slide, please. A little bit what looks ahead, particularly for EMD 003. We're on the precipice of commencing our trials. Those trials should last a few months. We'll get those completed, and then the dossier can be prepared. But also wanted to point out some of the other activities running in parallel here, particularly our commitment and investment into the psychedelic assisted therapy space for patients with severe PTSD, also some of the registration activities underway for EMD4, and to watch this space for announcements around our global program. We can go to the next slide, and the one after that. I think I'm done. Thanks, Tim. I'll take your questions.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. We actually had Mind Medicine Australia on some time back, and we had a webinar on the psychedelic industry in Canada in particular, and they run clinics with patients who are traumatized and obviously use MDMA to help that trauma. Yes. Why did you go down this clinical path in terms of having clinics? I mean, it seems like a very powerful way for people looking for treatment to come to you. Why did you adopt that model?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. It has been a significant and substantial investment for us to establish these clinics. We don't run them for profit. We run them in order to get the very best clinical outcome and also the very best data from our patients and evidence. And so that speaks to why we did this. It was about getting clear and high quality clinical evidence that can inform how these treatments can be best used, and ultimately can inform how to register these treatments. We saw that the growth in the special access scheme was just a short-term solution to what is a long-term problem. If these are truly going to become legitimate mainstream medicines, then they need to be accompanied with robust clinical evidence. And there just wasn't that evidence around, and people weren't investing in traditional trials to get that evidence. So it made sense to set up evidence-generating clinics, and that's what we did.
And sorry, just from my understanding, is that part of the future where a consumer, for want of a better word, a patient, comes to you has been recommended or prescribed by their doctor to come to you for further treatments?
That's right. Our model usually works that patients are referred to us when nothing else is working. We then do an evaluation, check that they're suitable for medicinal cannabis, put them in a program that can work for them. Our long-term goal, though, is to take those insights, develop treatments that can work for patients like them, and have those become mainstream options for regular doctors, and therefore reach a much larger patient population and a much larger commercial market too. And then our clinics will run as the place of last resort for the heart sync patients, so we can tackle the next unmet need with the next treatment option.
And just looking through your shareholder base, the Washer family, who I believe is also your chairman, they own 33% of the company. Can you tell us a little bit about their involvement and background?
Sure, yeah. Stuart's one of the founders. Stuart Washer is also involved heavily in a number of biotech companies. Sonata, involved in stem cells, orthocell, regenerative medicine. Has a lot of really great experience taking drugs through the FDA process and in biotech. He's one of the early founders of Emyria, originally Emerald Clinics. He's got a strong holding and he's holding on tight.
And just a question here, how do you manage kind of the complex legal liability issues? You know, all treatments have a range of real life outcomes and possibly unexpected reactions. How do you manage that?
That's a great question. We pay very close attention to adverse events. In fact, adverse events are typically underreported for all prescription medicines. So we carefully check in with every patient. We titrate doses to watch for adverse events. And it's one of the things we track. We use a number of clinical trial assessments or clinical trial grade assessments to get a read on where those adverse events are happening as well. So it's one of the aspects of this treatment which we characterize very deeply. We think that's incredibly important, not just for patient care, but also for generating evidence that a regulator will accept. Because as you would know, safety is one of the critical dimensions. Efficacy, does this work, being the second, and then quality of the product being really the third consideration that regulators have.